And if the biggest mistake in your spiritual life isn't in the things you do, but the things you think about when no one is looking, what if right now, as you're trying to look strong on the outside, there's a silent battle going on inside your mind? A battle you've lost several times without realizing it. Those thoughts that come back at night, those doubts that arise without warning, that feeling of being far from God, even trying to do everything right. What if this is not by chance? There is a place inside you where time seems to slow down, where a single idea can echo for hours, repeating itself, gaining strength, shaping feelings, influencing decisions. That's where insecurities, fears, and even that guilt that you can't explain are born. It's as if your own mind creates a labyrinth, and the more you try to get out, the more lost you feel. And in the midst of it all, an unsettling question arises. Why, even though we seek God, does there still seem to be a distance? What few realize is that there is something hidden in this process, something silent, almost invisible, but extremely powerful, a spiritual key that has always been within reach, but that most have never been taught to use. It's not something complicated nor distant, but it's hidden in a place where almost no one looks. And perhaps this is exactly what explains why so many people live trapped in cycles that they can never break. Now imagine for a moment if it were possible to interrupt this cycle. If there was a way to completely transform what happens inside your mind, and as a consequence change everything around you, not with empty effort, not with external rules, but with something profound, real, and effective. Something that works in silence, where no one sees, but where everything begins. There is a spiritual code hidden in the deepest teachings of Jesus. Something simple in appearance, but with a power that can redefine your connection with God. The Bible has already revealed this, but few have really understood it. Proverbs 23:7 says, "For as he thought in his heart, so is he." And in Psalm 139:2 it is written, "You know my sitting down and my rising up. From afar you understand my thought." Today, you are not here by chance. There is something that needs to be revealed, and once you understand, your way of thinking will never be the same. And perhaps, even today, you feel something change inside you. In this video, you'll understand how to win the mind's silent battles, learn to recognize thoughts that don't come from God, and discover how to align your mind with the truth that sets you free. Each teaching has been carefully revealed to help you replace confusion with clarity, anxiety with peace, and doubt with steady, conscious faith. As you move forward, something begins to change inside, as if each word is reaching areas that no one else can touch, bringing answers that you didn't even know you needed. There is a purpose in you being here now. Perhaps this is the time when God begins to rearrange your thoughts and restore your connection with Him. And if that message is already speaking to you, don't ignore that sign. Leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and activate the bell, because this simple gesture can bring this truth to other people who also need to rediscover the peace that comes from God. There is something that almost no one realizes, but that silently defines the course of spiritual life. The mind is not just a place of thoughts. It is a disputed territory. Every day ideas arrive, feelings arise, thoughts appear without asking permission. And the big question is, where do they come from? And most importantly, where are they taking you? From the beginning, this battle already existed. In the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve didn't start by making mistakes with their hands. They started by making mistakes in their minds. The serpent did not force anyone to do anything. She just posed a question, almost innocent, almost subtle. Is that how God said? And at that moment, something changed. A doubt was planted. A distorted thought began to grow, and what was pure began to be contaminated by an idea that did not come from God. Notice this carefully. Before the fall existed in practice, it had already happened in thought. Before disobedience became visible, it was already formed within the mind. And this continues to happen to this day, silently, almost imperceptibly. Thoughts come as suggestions, as questions, as small internal voices. And when they are not discerned, they begin to shape decisions. The Bible reveals something profound in James 1:14-15. Each one is tempted when he is drawn away and enticed by his own lust. Afterward, when lust has conceived, it gives birth to sin. In other words, it all starts within. First comes thought, then acceptance, and only then action. This completely changes the way you understand spiritual life, because it shows that the root of everything is in what you allow to remain in your mind. Now imagine how many times you have struggled with attitudes without realizing that the real problem was before them, in the thoughts you fed without question. Ideas that seemed harmless, but that gradually made room for insecurity, fear, guilt, or even distancing from God. Thoughts are like doors, and not every door should be opened. Honoring God in thoughts begins right here, in discernment. Learning to identify when a thought does not come from Him is one of the most powerful keys that exist. Not everything you think is true, and not everything you feel needs to be accepted. There is a voice of God, but there are also other voices trying to occupy the same space. And perhaps when you hear this, you will begin to notice something that previously went unnoticed. Certain patterns, certain repetitive ideas, certain internal conflicts that seem to have no explanation. But now, something is starting to make sense. If this message is touching you in a different way, as if it were revealing something that has always been there but has never been clearly seen, don't ignore it. Sometimes it is in this quiet moment that God begins a profound change. If you felt this touch, write in the comments, Amen. It may sound simple, but sometimes a word is the beginning of a transformation that changes everything. If there is something that completely changes the way we see the spiritual life, it is to realize that Jesus did not just come to correct behaviors. He came to raise the standard to the level of thoughts. While many were concerned only with what was visible, Jesus went straight to the invisible, to the place where everything begins. And when He spoke, He left no room for superficial interpretation. He revealed something that to this day confronts any comfort zone. In Matthew 5:28 it is written, "Whoever looks at a woman with unclean intent has already committed adultery with her in his heart." This is not just a teaching, it's a reality check, because it shows that for God, what happens inside the mind has the same weight as what happens outside. The gaze may be silent, the thought may be hidden, but before God, everything is exposed, and this completely changes the way we understand what it means to truly honor God. Jesus was teaching that purity is not something that is demonstrated. It is something that is cultivated internally, every day, in every thought that arises. It is not just about avoiding the mistake, but about not allowing it to find space within the mind. Because when thought is fed, it takes root, and roots over time bear fruit. Now think sincerely, how many times have you tried to do right on the outside, but on the inside you were conflicted? How many times has no one seen anything, but inside their mind there was a constant struggle? That's exactly where Jesus is pointing. Because honoring God is not about spiritual appearance. It's about inner truth. And that's why the Apostle Paul gives such direct guidance in Philippians 4:8. Whatever is true, whatever is honest, whatever is just, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, think on this. Note that this is not optional advice. It is a clear direction on how the mind should be trained. Thinking right does not happen by chance. It is a daily, conscious, and often challenging choice. Jesus lived exactly like that. At no time did He allow misaligned thoughts to define His attitudes. Even though He was tempted, even though He was pressed, He kept His mind steady, in line with the Father's will. This reveals something powerful. It is possible to live with a mind aligned with God, even in the midst of a world full of distractions and influences. And perhaps what has the most impact here is to understand that this standard was not presented to be admired, but to be lived. There is a silent invitation for you to also begin to observe your thoughts more carefully, not with guilt, but with awareness. Because it is in this invisible place that true transformation begins to happen. If this word is awakening in you a deep desire to align yourself more with God, comment right now, "Speak, Lord, your servant hears." Write it as a sincere prayer. And if it makes sense to you, leave your like on this video, because it helps this message to reach other people who are also seeking to live a truer faith. There is a detail that many people ignore, and this ends up generating frustration. The transformation of the mind does not happen all at once. It's not something instantaneous. It's not a snap. It's not an isolated moment. It's a process. And understanding this changes everything, because it takes the weight off the immediate demand and puts the focus on constancy. Honoring God in your thoughts is not about never having wrong thoughts again. It's about learning to continually renew them. Paul's story reveals this in a profound way. Before he became one of the greatest apostles, he was dominated by thoughts that were completely misaligned with God. He believed he was right, convinced, decisive, but it was going in the opposite direction, until, in a real encounter with Jesus, something began to change. It was not just a change of attitude. It was an inner transformation, a complete renewal of the mind. But notice, even after this meeting, Paul did not become perfect overnight. He wrote about it himself. In Romans 12:2, he says, "Be transformed by the renewing of your mind." Transform yourselves. This indicates continuity. It's not something that happens once and ends. It's something that needs to be lived every day. In Ephesians 4:23, he reinforces, "and be renewed in the spirit of your mind." In other words, there is a constant practice, a daily movement of adjustment, alignment, vigilance. Now think, how many times have you tried to change but gave up because you thought it wasn't working fast enough? How many times have you blamed yourself for still having certain thoughts, as if it nullifies your walk with God? But the truth is that the process is part of it. Each time you choose to reject a wrong thought and replace it with a thought aligned with God, something is being rebuilt within you. Renewing the mind is like growing a garden. You don't plant today and reap tomorrow. There is time, care, attention. You need to uproot what doesn't work, plant what's right, and water constantly. And with thoughts, it is exactly like that. What you feed grows, what you ignore weakens, and little by little, almost without realizing it, his way of thinking begins to change. What once dominated you loses strength. What seemed automatic is beginning to be questioned, and a new consciousness begins to form, not because you tried harder, but because you stayed in the process. Perhaps at this moment, the most important thing is not to look at how much you still need to change, but recognize that God has already started something inside you, and this is already proof that the transformation is underway. If this truth makes sense in your heart, as a reminder that God is still at work in you, write in the comments, "God is renewing my mind." Sometimes, declaring this is the first step to living this reality even more deeply. As the mind begins to be renewed, an even deeper need arises, to learn to discern what really comes from God. Because here's a turning point. Not every thought that crosses your mind is of divine origin. Some look good, others feel real but carry confusion, fear, or pressure. And if there is no discernment, everything is mixed, and the person ends up following voices that were never from God. Samuel's story reveals something extremely important about this. He was young, in the right environment, serving in the temple, but he still couldn't recognize God's voice. When God spoke to him for the first time, Samuel mistook that voice for Eli's voice. He ran to the man thinking he had been called, but he wasn't. This happened more than once, until he was told to respond differently. "Speak, Lord, for your servant hears." And at that moment something changed. It was no longer just listening, it was to recognize. How often does this also happen today? Thoughts arise, directions appear, feelings intensify, and the person believes that it is God speaking, when in fact it may only be one's own mind, fear, or even external influences. This is why discerning God's voice is one of the most important spiritual skills anyone can develop. Jesus made this clear in John 10:27, "My sheep hear my voice, and I know them, and they follow me." There is a voice, but there is also recognition. It's not just about listening, it's about knowing it's Him. And this doesn't happen automatically. This is built with relationships, with time, with intimacy. The voice of God does not create confusion, does not push with despair, does not carry a weight that paralyzes. She can correct, she can confront, but she always leads with clarity and peace. Thoughts that do not come from Him usually carry anxiety, accusation, constant doubt. And this is where many get lost, because they have not learned to separate these voices. Honoring God in thoughts goes directly through this filter. Is what I'm thinking aligned with God's voice? Does it produce peace or create unrest? Does it bring me closer or further away from Him? These questions begin to create a kind of spiritual sensitivity that completely transforms the way we live. And the more you practice this, the clearer it becomes. Gradually, that inner confusion begins to give way to a clearer direction. What once seemed like noise begins to organize, and a voice begins to stand out, firm, constant, unmistakable. Perhaps at this moment you are beginning to realize that not everything you believe to be God's direction really was, and that's not a reason to blame. It is an invitation to a deeper level of relationship. If you're here so far, it's because something inside you recognizes that God is teaching you to hear His voice better, and that's just the beginning. Later on, something even stronger will be revealed, something that can completely change your way of thinking and connecting with God. And at the end, there will be a special time of prayer where all this will be placed before Him. So stick with it until the end, because that may be one of the most important moments of your spiritual journey. There is a silent principle that defines the quality of your thoughts, and it often goes unnoticed. What you allow to enter is exactly what begins to dwell within you. The mind does not create everything by itself. It absorbs, registers, and then reproduces. And that's why honoring God in your thoughts requires constant vigilance over what you see, hear, and consume every day. Job understood this in a profound way. In the midst of a life marked by intense challenges, he made a decision that reveals spiritual maturity. "I have made a covenant with my eyes." It was not a superficial attitude, it was a position. He decided, even before the temptation came, that he would not allow his eyes to be a gateway to that which might contaminate his mind. This shows that protecting thoughts begins long before they exist. It starts with the daily choices, the small details that seem harmless. Now think honestly, how many things have you allowed into your mind without realizing the impact they have? Conversations, images, news, content, all of this accumulates, forming an internal environment that, little by little, influences the way you think, feel, and react. And when the mind is full of noise, it becomes much more difficult to perceive God's voice clearly. Hence, Proverbs 4:23 carries a direct warning, "Above all things that should be guarded, guard your heart." It's not just about keeping, it is to keep above all. This shows priority, because the heart in this context represents the interior, the mind, the center of decisions. If this is not protected, everything else is disorganized. And here is a point that few face. There is no neutrality. Either you are feeding your mind with that which brings you closer to God, or you are allowing it to be shaped by that which takes you away from Him. Even if it seems subtle, even if it seems small, everything leaves marks. And these marks, over time, turn into automatic thoughts. But there is a clear way out. Start filtering. Not everything needs to be included. Not everything deserves space. Not everything should be maintained. As you start to better select what you consume, something begins to change internally. The mind becomes lighter, cleaner, more sensitive. And what once seemed normal starts to bother, for now there is discernment. To guard the mind is not to live in isolation. It is to live consciously. It is understanding that every choice has a spiritual impact, and that protecting your thoughts is actually protecting your connection to God. Perhaps at this moment you are noticing areas that need to be adjusted, simple decisions that can make a big difference on the inside. And this is already a sign that something is awakening within you. Now state in the comments, "Lord, I receive your teachings." Write as an act of sincere surrender. And if this message made sense to you, leave your like, because then other people can also find this path of peace and clarity that comes from God. There is an invisible force that begins to act long before any change happens on the outside. And this force is born within the mind. Faith doesn't start when something happens. It starts when you decide what you're going to believe, even when everything around you points in the opposite direction. And this is where many get lost, because they hope to feel and then believe, when in fact the path has always been the opposite. Abraham is one of the greatest examples of this. The Bible says at Romans 4:18, "Who in hope believed against hope." This means that even when there was no visible reason to believe, he chose to keep his thoughts in line with what God had promised. Imagine the weight of that. Time passing, circumstances contradicting, logic saying that it was not possible. And yet, within his mind, he held a different truth. This is exactly where faith manifests itself most powerfully. It is not when everything is favorable, but when the thought decides to remain firm, even in the face of doubt. Because, deep down, the biggest battle has never been external. It has always been internal. And those who win inside inevitably begin to see reflections outside. Hebrews 11:1 says, "Faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen." This reveals something profound. Faith functions as an invisible foundation. Before something exists in reality, it already exists within the mind of the believer. It is as if you were holding something that you cannot yet touch, but that is already real within you. Now think, how many times have you stopped believing because you looked too much at the circumstances? How many times have your thoughts been shaped by fear, doubt, or what seemed impossible? And without realizing it, you ended up moving away from what God had already prepared. Thoughts of faith do not ignore reality, but choose not to limit themselves to it. They see beyond. They connect with something bigger, with promises that don't depend on the current moment. And when you start feeding this kind of thinking, something inside you gets stronger. A silent security begins to grow. A peace that does not depend on explanation begins to take place. Honoring God in your thoughts also goes through this. Choosing to believe when it would be easier to give up, choosing to trust when everything seems uncertain, choosing to stay when the will is to retreat. Because every thought of faith is like a seed planted in an invisible ground, and at the right time it starts to bear fruit. And maybe, right now, God is calling you to just that level of faith. Not a faith based on what you see, but a faith built inside your mind, where no one else can interfere. If this message is already touching your heart, know that this is not by chance. Maybe it's God showing you that there's still something bigger in store for you. And if you felt this word vividly, enjoy this moment. Leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and activate the bell. because then this message reaches other people who also need to strengthen faith and renew hope. There is a moment in the spiritual life that almost no one talks about. That point where even after a great victory, the mind begins to be silently attacked. That is exactly what happened to Elias. He had just experienced one of the greatest miracles, faced prophets, seen the power of God manifest itself in a supernatural way. But soon after, something changed inside him. At 1 Kings 19:4, he prays a prayer that reveals the state of his mind. Take my life now. The same man who faced crowds was now alone, tired, overwhelmed by thoughts of giving up. This shows something profound. No matter how spiritually strong someone is, if the mind is not guarded, it can become a field of oppression. Maybe you've experienced something similar. Moments when everything seemed fine, but suddenly negative thoughts began to arise without explanation. An unexpected sadness, a silent discouragement, a desire to stop. And the most difficult thing is that, many times, this does not make logical sense. But it's real. And it happens inside. What stands out in this story is not only Elijah's emotional fall, but the way God dealt with it. God didn't start by restoring his mission. It began by restoring the mind. First, he brought rest, then care, then direction. As if to say, first of all, you need to reorganize what is happening inside you, and here's a powerful key. Negative thoughts aren't defeated with ignorance, but with positioning. It is not enough to try to forget, it is necessary to replace. It is not enough to resist, it is necessary to realign. Isaiah 26:3 declares, "You will keep in peace the one whose mind is set on you." Peace does not come from the absence of problems, it comes from the steadfastness of thoughts in God. This means that even when oppressive thoughts arise, you don't have to accept them as truth. You can confront, you can filter, you can choose what you will remain in. And this is not easy, but it is possible. Every time you decide not to feed a negative thought, you weaken it. Every time you turn your mind to God, you strengthen your peace. And little by little, what seemed to dominate begins to lose ground. The mind reorganizes, clarity returns, and that feeling of heaviness begins to disappear. Not because everything has changed around us, but because something has been restored inside. Perhaps as you listen to this, someone has come to your mind. Someone who is going through an internal struggle, someone who needs this peace, someone who may not even know how to get out of this place. This moment is not by chance. If there is someone who needs prayer, write their name in the comments. It can be someone close or even someone far away, but that God has placed in your heart now. By doing so, you join a current of faith that goes beyond screens and reaches lives in real ways. And I believe that just as God began to restore Elijah's mind, he can also begin a transformation in that person's life. There is a level of worship that goes beyond words, beyond songs, beyond any outward manifestation. It is the level where the mind becomes a constant altar before God. Because the truth is that it's not just about what you say or do when everyone is watching, but what you think when you're alone, in silence, away from any human gaze. David understood this in a profound way. Even though he is a king, a warrior, a leader, he carried a concern that few have, to please God in his thoughts. In Psalm 19:14, he declares something that reveals the level of his surrender. Let the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be pleasant before your face, O Lord. Notice that he doesn't just talk about words. He speaks of meditation, of what happens inside, in the place where no one else sees. This completely changes the way we see worship, because adoring is not just a moment, it is a state. It's not something that starts when the music plays and ends when the environment changes. It is something continuous, which manifests itself even in the simplest thoughts of everyday life. That's when your mind begins to naturally incline toward God. even without effort, even without obligation. Now imagine this in practice. Your thoughts are no longer dominated by constant worries and start to turn more to what comes from above. Not in a forced way, but as a consequence of a heart that desires to please God in everything. This is exactly what Colossians 3:2 directs. Set your mind on the things that are above, and not on the things that are on the earth. It's not a suggestion. It is a clear direction as to where the mind should remain, and when that starts to happen, something changes deep within you. The mind ceases to be a place of conflict and becomes a space of communion. What used to generate anxiety begins to lose strength because now there is a new reference. Your thoughts begin to reflect God's presence, and that impacts everything: your decisions, your emotions, your attitudes. Honoring God in one's thoughts is, in fact, living silent worship. It is to transform each thought into a gesture of reverence, each reflection into an act of surrender. It's not about perfection, it's about constant intention. It's about turning your mind to God as many times as necessary until it becomes natural. And perhaps the deepest of all this is to realize that God is not distant from this process. He sees, He knows, He is pleased when He finds a heart that desires to honor Him even in the unseen details. And it is in this place that true intimacy begins to grow. None of this happens by chance. If this message has reached you, there is a purpose being drawn in silence. Stay until the end, because there is something even deeper being prepared, a moment where all of this will connect clearly and vividly within you. There is a moment in life when everything seems to depend on a decision, and what many don't realize is that, before any choice is made, it has already begun to be built within the mind. Decisions are not born on impulse. They are born in thoughts that have been nurtured, repeated, and accepted over time. And it is precisely here that honoring God becomes something decisive. Joshua understood this even before he took on one of the greatest responsibilities of his life. He didn't start leading. He began by learning to think. Before leading an entire nation, he was instructed to align his mind with God's word. In Joshua 1:8 it is written, "Do not cease to speak of this book of the law, but meditate on it day and night, that you may be careful to do according to all that is written in it." Notice the order. First meditate, then act. First align your thinking, then make decisions. This reveals a powerful principle. Safe decisions are built on thoughts that have already been filtered through God's presence. When the mind is filled with the Word, when the thoughts are rooted in the truth, the choices cease to be impulsive and become directed. And this completely changes the outcome of life. Now think about it. How many decisions have you made based only on what you felt at the moment? How many choices have been made without seeking direction, without stopping to discern, without submitting that thought to God? And many times, regret does not come because the intention was bad, but because the thought was not aligned before the action. Proverbs 3:5-6 brings a warning that needs to be taken seriously. Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and do not lean on your own understanding. In all your ways, acknowledge Him, and He will direct your paths. Not relying on one's own understanding means just that, not blindly trusting the first thoughts that arise, but learning to bring them before God, because the mind, when it is not aligned, can deceive. It can make wrong seem right. It can generate haste where there should be waiting. It can create certainties where there should still be search. But when thoughts are submitted to God, something different happens. There arises a peace that confirms, a clarity that directs, a security that does not depend on circumstances. Joshua did not become firm in his decisions by chance. He learned to feed his mind with what came from God every day, continually. And this formed a solid foundation within him, where each choice was a consequence of an already aligned thought. Honoring God in your thoughts is just that, not allowing important decisions to be made in a disorganized, hurried, or confused mind. It is choosing to stop, reflect, seek until the thought is at peace before God. Because when the mind is aligned, the path becomes clearer, and what once seemed uncertain is starting to gain direction. There are sores that do not appear on the body, but completely shape the way a person thinks. And the most delicate thing is that when the soul is wounded, thoughts begin to distort without the person realizing it. What was once hope becomes doubt. What was once confidence turns into fear. And little by little, the mind begins to repeat internal stories that keep the pain alive. But there is a powerful detail that changes everything. The healing of the soul can also begin within the mind. The story of the woman of the flow of blood reveals this in a profound way. For years, she carried constant pain, a condition that not only affected her body, but also her identity, her dignity, her hope. Humanly, everything pointed to the end, to giving up, to the acceptance of a life limited by pain. And yet, something different happened inside her. Before any external miracle, there was an internal decision. In Mark 5:28 it is written, "For he said, 'If I only touch his garment, I will be healed.'" Notice this carefully, she said. It was a thought repeated, fed, strengthened within the mind. While many could have chosen discouragement, she chose to believe. This shows that even in the midst of pain, there is a space within us where spiritual decisions can be made. The wound may even exist, but it does not have to define the thought. And when the thinking changes, something starts to line up differently. The mind ceases to be a place of imprisonment and becomes a starting point for restoration. Psalm 147:3 states, "He heals the broken-hearted and binds up their wounds." God does not ignore pain, he treats it. But often this treatment begins when the person decides not to feed the thoughts that perpetuate the wound anymore. When he chooses, even if with difficulty, to think differently, to believe differently, to wait again. Now think sincerely. How many wounds are still being kept alive by the thoughts that replay within you? How many times does the pain come back, not because something new happened, but because the mind constantly relives it, and without realizing it, the cycle continues. But there is a way out, and it starts in a simple but profound way. Choose a new thought. Not based on pain, but on promise. Not based on the past, but on what God can still do. Just like that woman did, you can also begin to declare internally something different, something that aligns with hope. And little by little this begins to generate movement, perhaps not immediate, perhaps not visible at first, but real. Because restored thoughts become channels through which healing begins to flow. If that word has reached something within you, as if it touches an area that needs restoration, don't ignore that moment. Perhaps it is God initiating a silent process in your soul. If this spoke to you, write in the comments, "I trust in God." May this simple statement be the beginning of something new happening within you. There is something that may be taking you away from God without you realizing it. It is not a lack of faith. It is not a lack of will. It is not even the absence of prayer. It's the excess of noise inside your mind. Thoughts that don't stop. Worries that accumulate, memories that come back, internal voices that compete for attention all the time. And in the midst of all this, the question remains, how to listen to God like this? Many people expect God to speak in a grandiose, intense, unmistakable way, but Elijah's experience reveals a completely different path. He was also in a moment of exhaustion, confusion, and searching. And when God decided to manifest himself, it was not in the way he imagined. First came a strong wind, then an earthquake, then fire. But God was not in any of them. And then, in 1 Kings 19:12, something amazing happens. After the fire, a still, small voice. It was there, in silence, in the almost imperceptible. In what can only be heard when everything else is silent, this reveals a profound principle. God does not compete with the noise of the mind. He speaks where there is space, where there is stillness, where there is attention. And if the mind is constantly full, fast-paced, too busy, even with legitimate things, it is difficult to perceive that soft voice. Psalm 46:10 brings an invitation that many ignore. Be still and know that I am God. To quiet down is not just to stop physically, it is to silence internally. It is to slow down the pace of thoughts. It is to slow down worries. It is to create an environment where God can be perceived. But this does not happen automatically. It is a practice, a decision. In the midst of the rush, choose to stop for a few moments. In the midst of the excess of information, choose to filter. In the midst of anxiety, choose to breathe and turn your attention to God. Gradually, this exercise begins to change the way you perceive the world and His presence, and something starts to happen. That sense of distance diminishes. That internal confusion begins to organize, and the voice of God, which once seemed distant, begins to be recognized in a clearer, more intimate, more real way. Honoring God in your thoughts is also this, not allowing the mind to live in constant agitation, but learning to cultivate moments of silence where He can speak. Because many answers you seek are not at high volume, they are in stillness. Perhaps what you need most today is not to do more, but to silence more. Do not run any further, but stop for a moment and realize that God is already near, just waiting for space to be heard. If you are here, it is not by chance. There is something being adjusted within you, something being aligned in a silent way, and what is yet to be revealed may further deepen this connection. Stay until the end, because this journey is leading you to a level of intimacy with God that can completely transform the way you think and live. There is something going on these days that goes beyond what meets the eye. It's not just the busiest world, nor just the excess of information. It is a real contest for your attention, for your thoughts, for the direction of your mind. And the most dangerous thing is that this happens silently, constantly, almost imperceptibly. When you realize it, you are already thinking things that you did not consciously choose. You are already feeling weights that you don't even know where they came from. That is exactly why Jesus issued such a direct warning at Matthew 24:42. Watch out, therefore, because you do not know what hour your Lord is coming. Watching is not just observing the world around you. It is to observe what is happening inside you. It is to keep the mind awake, attentive, aware. Because when there is no vigilance, any thought finds space, any influence takes root. And here's a point that many overlook. The distracted mind becomes vulnerable, not because the person wants to, but because they don't realize it. Small distractions take up space, thoughts get mixed up, and when you realize it, there is already confusion. There is already mental fatigue. There is already a silent distance from God. 1 Peter 1:13 brings us strong and necessary guidance for this time. Gird up the loins of your mind. Be sober. In other words, prepare your mind. Organize your thoughts. Stand firm. This requires discipline. It requires intention. It is not automatic. It is a daily choice not to let the mind loose, not to live on autopilot. Because when the mind is not directed, it gets lost in chaos. And chaos today doesn't scream. It distracts. He occupies, he tires, he confuses. And without realizing it, the person moves away from what really matters. Not out of rebellion, but out of lack of vigilance. Honoring God in one's thoughts at this time is an act of spiritual resistance. It is choosing to keep the mind steady when everything around you tries to disperse. It is turning one's attention to God even when there are 1,000 other things competing for space. It is not allowing any thought to remain, but filtering, observing, adjusting. And perhaps the most important thing is to understand that this urgency is not to generate fear, but awareness. It is a call to wake up spiritually, to realize that the way you take care of your mind today is defining your spiritual future. Perhaps, as you listen to this, you will begin to recognize areas where you have been living on automatic, thoughts that have come in unfiltered, distractions that have stolen your peace. But the mere fact of noticing this is already a sign that something is awakening within you. God has been good, even when you haven't noticed. He has sustained, guarded, directed. And recognizing this is also part of keeping the mind aligned with Him. If you feel in your heart that God has taken care of you, even in the details, write in the comments, Amen. Sometimes a simple statement makes room for an even greater awareness of His presence in your life. There is a truth that few realize until they live it in practice. What happens inside the mind is not hidden forever. At some point, it becomes visible. Thoughts shape attitudes, attitudes build behaviors, and behaviors reveal who a person really is. This is why a mind aligned with God inevitably turns into a living testimony. Daniel is a striking example of this. He was taken to an environment completely contrary to the principles he learned at an early age, a corrupted culture full of influences, pressures, and temptations. Everything around him pointed to a different path. But before any external decision, something was already defined within him. Daniel 1:8 makes this point clearly. Daniel sat down in his heart, not to defile himself. He decided this internally. It wasn't a reaction at the time. It wasn't an impulsive choice. It was a decision built in the mind, firmly in the heart. And that's exactly what made all the difference. Because when the thought is already aligned, the external pressure loses strength. When the decision has already been made inside, the environment cannot change who you are. And that's how Daniel lived. Even in the face of kings, even in risky situations, he remained steadfast. Not because he was strong in his own right, but because his mind was already in place. And this began to generate something visible. His life came to reflect this integrity, his posture, his words, his choices. Everything pointed to something different. And without having to announce, without having to convince, he became a living testimony. Jesus spoke of this at Matthew 5:16, "Let your light so shine before men." Realize that light doesn't need to make an effort to be noticed. It just shines. And when the mind is aligned with God, that light begins to appear naturally in the person's life. Now think, maybe you are waiting for an opportunity to impact someone, to be used by God, to make a difference. But it all starts long before that. It starts with the way you think when no one is watching. It starts with the silent choices, the internal decisions, the thoughts you feed every day, because it is these thoughts that will form the basis of your life. And this base, over time, becomes visible to everyone around. People may not understand what is happening, but they realize that there is something different, a peace that is not common, a firmness that is not normal, a light that cannot be explained only from the outside. And maybe God is calling you to do just that, not just to live an inner transformation, but to become a living reflection of that transformation, not through words, but through a mind that has been renewed and aligned with Him. This word is not for everyone. If you are here, it is because something is being worked on within you in a deep and intentional way. And what is yet to come may reveal even more about the purpose God is building in your life. Stay, because this journey is just beginning to show what can really happen when the mind becomes an instrument in God's hands. There is a point in the spiritual journey where everything can change, not because of what happens outside, but because of a revelation that hits directly into the mind. It is in this place that true transformation begins. And perhaps no example is as strong as Saul's. He was not someone lost in the ordinary sense. On the contrary, he was disciplined, religious, convinced. He believed he was doing the right thing. His thoughts were organized. His mind was steady, but completely misaligned with God's truth. This shows something unsettling. It is possible to be right in one's mind and still be far from God. Saul persecuted Christians with a clear conscience. To him, that made sense. Until, at an unexpected moment, everything was interrupted. On the road to Damascus, something happened that was not only external, it was internal. A voice broke his thoughts, confronted his certainties, dismantled his logic. And in Acts 9:5 he hears, "I am Jesus whom thou persecute." That phrase not only revealed who Jesus was, revealed who Saul was being. In an instant, everything he believed in began to crumble. And this is exactly how divine truth works. It not only informs, it transforms. It enters the mind, confronts, exposes, realigns. From that meeting, Saulo was not only someone who changed his behavior, he became someone else. Paul was born of a mind that was completely renewed. What he once defended, he now understood in a totally different way. What he once fought, he now lived. But the deepest thing was not just the change of direction, it was the change in mentality. At Philippians 2:5 he himself writes, "Let this mind be in you, that was also in Christ Jesus." This reveals that the transformation did not end at that meeting. She continued. It was a process of aligning the mind with the very thought of Christ. And here's the key. True change doesn't happen when you just decide to do it differently. It happens when you start thinking differently. When the truth comes in, what was normal no longer seems acceptable. What seemed right is beginning to be questioned, and a new way of looking at everything is beginning to emerge. Perhaps at this moment you are realizing that some ideas that you have carried for a long time need to be revised. Thoughts that felt right, but were never aligned with God's truth. And that's not a problem. It is a sign that transformation may be beginning. Because when the mind finds the truth, there is no longer any way to go on the same way. Something breaks, something reorganizes, something repositions. And from there, a new path begins to be built, not based on what you have always thought, but based on what God is now revealing. There is a silent influence that shapes thoughts without the person realizing it. It's the people around. The mind is not only formed by what you decide on your own, but also by the environment in which you are inserted. Conversations, attitudes, values, all of this builds a kind of atmosphere that directly influences the way you think. The early church understood this in a profound way. They didn't just live in close proximity physically, they were aligned internally. Acts 4:32 describes this scenario powerfully. Out of the multitude of those who believed was one heart and soul. This means that there was a unity that went beyond words. There was a connection of thoughts, of purpose, of spiritual direction. Now imagine the impact of this. An environment where everyone is seeking the same truth, where thoughts strengthen each other, where the faith of one sustains the other. This creates a spiritual strength that cannot be ignored. Because when people unite with their minds aligned in God, the environment is transformed. On the other hand, when someone is surrounded by negative influences, misaligned thoughts begin to seem normal. Doubts are reinforced, fears are fed, values are distorted. And many times the person does not even realize that their way of thinking is no longer the same. That is why Hebrews 10:24-25 provides such a clear guideline. Let us consider one another to incite to love and good works. It's not just being together. It is to stimulate, encourage, strengthen. Is to participate in an environment where thoughts are edified and not destroyed. Honoring God in your thoughts also involves choosing who you walk with, who you listen to, who influences your life, because these connections will, little by little, shape your mind. And when you're surrounded by people who also seek God, something naturally begins to change. Your faith is strengthened, your vision broadens, your thoughts align more easily. Maybe you've realized this at some point. When you are in an environment of faith, your mind is elevated. When you're in a negative environment, your mind weighs down. This is not a coincidence. It is spiritual influence happening in a real way. And God has not called you to walk alone. There is a purpose in living in communion, in being part of something bigger, in sharing a journey where thoughts are constantly adjusted and strengthened. Maybe now you are understanding why some phases of your life were more difficult than others, not just for what you faced, but for who was by your side at that moment. And at the same time, it reveals something powerful. When you take a stand, you also become an influence. Your thinking begins to impact other people. Your words begin to edify. Your presence begins to bring light. Can you imagine how many people are in need of exactly this right now? A word, a direction, a touch of God through someone. If this message has reached you, you can also be an instrument to reach others. By liking this video, subscribing to the channel, and activating the bell, you help this word reach those who need it, becoming part of something bigger that goes far beyond this moment. There is a type of thinking that does not go away. He doesn't arrive with noise. He doesn't force. He doesn't scream, but it remains. It comes back when you try to ignore it. It shows up when you're silent. It insists even when you doubt. And often people don't realize that this kind of thinking can carry something much deeper than a simple idea. It can be a calling. Moses lived exactly that. He was living an ordinary life, far from the purpose God had prepared, until something caught his attention. A bush burned, but it was not consumed. Exodus 3:2 describes this moment. The bush burned with fire and was not consumed. That was not just an external phenomenon. It was a sign of something internal that would begin to happen. Because before Moses accepted the call, he had to deal with thoughts. Doubts arose, insecurities appeared, questions took place. He tried to resist, he tried to dodge, he tried to come up with reasons for not following what was being put before him. But there was something that didn't go away. The idea was still there, firm, constant, impossible to ignore. And that's exactly how many callings begin. Not as a clear order at the beginning, but as a thought that does not lose strength over time. Something that touches deeply, that bothers you in the right sense, that makes you realize that there is more, that there is something beyond what you are living now. Jeremiah 1:5 reveals something even deeper about this. Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. This means that the call doesn't start when you realize it. It already existed before. And when the time is right, it begins to manifest, often through thoughts that arise persistently. But here's the most important point. Not every persistent thought is a call, but every true call finds a place in the mind before it becomes action. And discerning this requires spiritual sensitivity, because God's call does not create confusion, even when it challenges. It can bring fear, it can confront limitations, but it also carries a conviction that cannot be easily explained. Maybe you've felt this at some point, a direction that didn't make logical sense, a desire to do something different, a restlessness that didn't seem common. And maybe you've ignored it, postponed it, or even tried to forget it, but somehow it never completely came out. Honoring God in your thoughts also involves recognizing these signs. Do not immediately reject, do not stifle what may be divine direction, but watch, pray, seek understanding, because when God plants something in the mind, He doesn't do it by chance. And little by little, what started as a thought can turn into direction. And what seemed like just an idea begins to reveal purpose. There is one of the most delicate moments of the spiritual life, one in which many voices speak at the same time. Thoughts intersect, doubts arise, feelings mix, and suddenly everything seems too confusing to make any decisions with confidence. And it is exactly in this scenario that many ask themselves how to recognize the voice of God in the midst of all this. Gideon experienced this kind of internal conflict. He wasn't safe, he didn't feel prepared, he didn't see himself as someone capable of accomplishing something great. In fact, their thoughts were filled with limitations, fear, and insecurity. But it was in this state that God approached and said something that completely changed the way he should see himself. "The Lord is with you, mighty man of valor." This is in Judges 6:12. Now stop and think. God called someone who saw himself as weak, valiant. This shows that God's voice does not always confirm what you feel, but reveals who you really are in his eyes. While Gideon's mind was filled with doubts, God brought clarity. While he saw limitations, God saw purpose. And this is exactly how God's voice works in the midst of confusion. It doesn't mix with chaos. She stands out by bringing direction. Isaiah 30:21 says, "This is the way, walk in it." It is not a voice that complicates, it is a voice that directs. It is not a voice that generates more doubt, it is a voice that brings a type of certainty that does not depend on the circumstances. The problem is that many times the other voices speak louder. Fear, insecurity, external opinions, past experiences, all of this creates an internal environment where God's truth can seem distant, but it is still there, firm, steady, waiting to be recognized. Honoring God in your thoughts involves learning to value his voice more than any other, even if, at first, it seems difficult to distinguish, even if there is confusion. Because the more you turn to that voice, the clearer it becomes, and little by little something begins to change inside you. What once seemed like a tangle of thoughts begins to organize. Decisions that seemed impossible are starting to gain direction. And a silent security begins to grow. Not because everything is solved, but because you now know who to trust. Perhaps at this moment you are exactly like this, with many voices inside you trying to understand which direction to go. But the mere fact that you are listening to this already shows that something is being aligned, because God keeps speaking, even in the midst of confusion. And when you learn to recognize that voice, everything starts to make more sense. If this video is bringing answers you needed to hear, don't let this moment pass. Write in the comments, "God takes care of me." Sometimes declaring this is the simplest way to silence other voices and strengthen what God is already speaking to your heart. There is a level of spiritual life that many desire, but few experience continuously. It is not just feeling God's presence at specific moments, but living aware of it all the time. And this does not happen by chance. It starts in the mind. The mind, when it is not consecrated, becomes only a place of loose thoughts, external influences, and constant distractions. But when it is given to God, something changes profoundly. It ceases to be a common space and becomes a sanctuary, a place where God's presence doesn't just visit, but he does. Davi lived this reality intensely. He did not depend on circumstances to feel close to God, because within him there was a constant awareness of this presence. In Psalm 16:8 he declares, "I have set the Lord before me continually." That wasn't just a pretty phrase, it was a practice. He intentionally chose to keep his mind turned to God. Now think about the impact of that. In the midst of wars, challenges, pressures, difficult decisions, still his mind remained connected. This reveals that God's presence does not depend on the surrounding environment, but on the internal positioning. When the mind is consecrated, even the most difficult moments are experienced differently. Jesus reinforces this at John 14:23. "We shall come to him and make our home with him." It is not a passing visit, It is a home. This means permanence, constancy, continuous relationship. But this abode does not take place in a physical place. It happens within, inside, in the mind and heart of those who decide to live in line with God. And here's the bottom line. When the mind is consecrated, God's presence stops being something you seek only at specific times and becomes something you carry. It's no longer about feeling once in a while. It's about living connected. It is about thinking, deciding, and acting with the awareness that He is present. This transforms everything. Thoughts begin to filter naturally. That which does not please God no longer finds space easily. The mind becomes more sensitive, more aligned, more firm, and a constant peace begins to occupy the place where there was once agitation. Perhaps what you're looking for most is not just answers, but that feeling of closeness, of not feeling alone, of knowing that God is there in every moment. And this reality is not far away. It begins when the mind is surrendered, when thoughts are directed, when there is a decision to live conscious of His presence. And little by little, this stops being an effort and becomes a state. The mind gets used to God, aligns itself with Him, abides in Him, and what was once rare is starting to become constant. What you will hear next can further deepen this experience and reveal something that many never realized in time. Stay until the end, because there is a dimension of this presence that still needs to be awakened within you. There is a profound difference between intense spiritual moments and a truly transformed life. Many people have felt something strong at some point, have had remarkable experiences, but return to the same thought patterns soon after. This is because true renewal is not only in what you feel, it's in what you decide to do with your mind every day. Nehemiah shows us this kind of maturity. He was given a clear mission to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. But what few realize is that his biggest battle was not only external, it was internal. As he advanced, distractions, threats, invitations to stop, pressures to give up appeared. And all of this started by trying to reach his mind. But there was a decisive moment when he replied firmly, "I am doing a great work, so I cannot come down." This is in Nehemiah 6:3. This wasn't just an answer to people. It was an internal statement. He decided that his thoughts would not be diverted, that his attention would not be stolen, that his mind would remain in line with what God had set before him. And that's exactly what defines a renewed mind. It's not the absence of distractions, but the ability to not get carried away by them. It is not a lack of pressure, but firmness in the face of it. Because there will always be voices trying to interrupt, thoughts trying to divert, situations trying to confuse. But when the mind is submitted to God, it learns to abide. Colossians 3:10 says, "And you put on the new that is being renewed to knowledge." This reveals that renewal is not an isolated event. It is an ongoing process. Every day the mind needs to be adjusted, repositioned, realigned with the truth. It's not automatic, it's intentional. Now think, how many times have you started something with conviction but lost focus halfway through because of distractions? How many times did external thoughts end up influencing more than what God had already placed in your heart? This is not a lack of capacity, it is a lack of protection of the mind. Nehemiah did not allow this. He understood that going down in that context was not just physically leaving the place. It was to descend mentally. It was to allow your attention to be diverted from what really mattered. And he decided to stay. Honoring God in your thoughts is also this, keeping your mind steady on what He has already revealed, even when other voices try to compete. It is not to trade your attention with that which does not come from God. It is recognizing that there is something bigger going on and that your mind needs to be aligned with that purpose. And when that happens, something powerful forms within you. A stability that does not depend on circumstances. a clarity that is not easily lost, a silent force that sustains your decisions. The submitted mind becomes protected, and a protected mind becomes unshakable, not because it is never challenged, but because it has learned where to stand. There is a level of spiritual understanding that completely changes the way you see your own life. That's when you start to realize that not everything that happens can be explained by the present moment alone. There are higher thoughts, deeper paths, and purposes that go beyond what the eye can see. Joseph lived exactly that. If anyone had every reason to entertain thoughts of revolt, pain, or injustice, it was him. Betrayed by his own brothers, sold into slavery, wronged even though he did the right thing. Everything around him pointed to a broken fate, but inside Joseph's mind, something was different. He did not allow events to define his way of thinking. Even in the midst of grief, he maintained a silent alignment with God. And years later, when everything was revealed, his words show the level of this awareness. "You meant evil against me, but God made it good." That's in Genesis 50:20. Notice the depth of this. Joseph did not deny the evil that was done to him, but he didn't stick to it either. He was able to see beyond. He accessed a type of thinking that is not common, a thought that sees purpose where others only see pain. And this is only possible when the mind begins to align with God's thoughts. Isaiah 55:8-9 states, "For my thoughts are not your thoughts, nor your ways my ways." This reveals that there is a difference between the human way of thinking and the divine way. And while the mind is limited to what it sees, feels, and understands in the moment, it easily gets caught up in pain, doubt, and confusion. But when you begin to seek God's thoughts, something changes. Their perception expands. Situations that once seemed meaningless are starting to take on new meaning. What seemed like a delay can be understood as preparation. What seemed like loss can reveal protection. And what seemed like an end may actually be the beginning of something bigger. Honoring God in your thoughts is also this, not limiting yourself to the immediate vision, but seeking to understand what God is doing beyond what you can see. It's choosing to trust that there is a purpose, even when everything seems disconnected, and this does not happen automatically. It is a constant exercise in aligning the mind with the truth, of rejecting thoughts that limit and embracing thoughts that uplift. Gradually, this practice changes the way you react, how you interpret, how you live. Maybe you're facing something today that doesn't make sense yet, something that seems unfair, difficult, confusing. But what if, like Joseph, there is something bigger being built behind it all? What if what you're living through right now is just a part of a plan that hasn't yet been fully revealed? Before we move on, there is something important at this point. If there is something in your heart that needs intervention, something that you need to put before God, write your prayer request in the comments. It could be something personal, family, or a situation that has taken away your peace. When you do that, you're not just writing, you are connecting with a faith that strengthens together, and together there is a power that goes beyond what we can see. There are times when the mind seems to find no rest. Thoughts multiply, worries accumulate, and the soul enters a state of tiredness that cannot be explained by the body alone. It's as if, inside, everything is too fast, too heavy, too difficult to organize. And in these moments, many try to fight it alone, without realizing that there is a different path. David knew this kind of anguish deeply. He didn't hide his internal struggles. He didn't pretend to be okay when he wasn't. At various times, his mind was full of conflicts, fears, pressures. But what differentiates David is not the absence of afflicted thoughts. That's what he did with them. At Psalm 94:19, he expresses this clearly. "In the many thoughts that multiply within me, let your consolations refresh my soul." Notice the sincerity of this. He does not say that the thoughts have disappeared, but that in the midst of them, he has found consolation. This reveals a powerful key. Peace does not come from the absence of thoughts, but from the presence of God in their midst. How many times is the mind filled with negative scenarios, difficult memories, worries that seem to have no end? And the more the person tries to control it, the more it seems that everything intensifies. But there is a turning point, when, instead of struggling alone, you begin to direct those thoughts to God. This does not mean ignoring the pain, but surrendering. It doesn't mean pretending that everything is fine, but allowing God to enter exactly where the mind is most burdened. And it is in this place that something begins to change. 2 Thessalonians 2:16-17 says, "Comfort your hearts and strengthen you." This shows that God's comfort is not only emotional, it strengthens, it reorganizes the interior, brings balance, gives back the ability to continue. And little by little, what once seemed like a whirlwind begins to calm down. Thoughts may still exist, but they no longer have the same weight. The mind begins to find pauses, spaces of rest, moments of silence that previously seemed impossible. Honoring God in your thoughts is also this, not allowing the mind to remain caught up in affliction, but bringing it to the place where there is comfort. It is recognizing that even when everything seems confusing inside, there is a source of peace available. Maybe you're living just that right now. Thoughts that don't stop, a feeling of overload, a restlessness that seems constant. But that word reveals something important. You don't have to carry it alone. When the mind finds God, it finds rest. And when this rest begins to touch the soul, everything begins to reorganize itself from the inside out. There is a type of mistake that does not start with a wrong choice. It starts with a thought that feels right. And that is exactly why spiritual discernment is so essential. Because not every thought that sounds good comes from God, and not every idea that makes sense at the moment is aligned with the truth. Eva experienced this kind of situation. In the garden, everything was perfect, everything was in order. But it only took one distorted thought to enter for everything to start changing. The snake did not present something absurd. She presented something subtle, a doubt, a suggestion, a distortion of what God had already said. And the most dangerous thing is that it seemed logical. The problem was not just listening, it was not discerning. It was allowing that thought to remain, to be analyzed, considered, until it became acceptable. And from there, the fall happened. This reveals something profound. Deception rarely presents itself as something clearly wrong. He disguises himself, adapts, gets closer to the truth, but carries a small distortion that changes everything. Now look at Jesus in the wilderness. He was also confronted with thoughts, suggestions, proposals, but the answer was completely different. In Matthew 4:4 he declares, "It is written, 'Man shall not live by bread alone.'" Jesus did not argue with the thought. He answered with the truth. He already had his mind aligned, trained, grounded in the Word. This shows that discernment is not born at the moment of pressure. It is built before. A mind that knows the truth more easily recognizes the lie. A mind that is full of the Word is not easily deceived. 1 John 4:1 carries a direct warning. Do not believe every spirit, but prove. This means that not everything should be automatically accepted. Thoughts need to be tested, filtered, evaluated. And this requires attention. It requires awareness. It requires an active posture. How many times thoughts enter in a subtle way, bringing doubts, insecurities, ideas that seem small, but that over time begin to influence decisions. And when there is no discernment, these thoughts gain space, take root, and begin to shape the way we live. Honoring God in your thoughts is also developing this spiritual filter. Not accepting everything, not believing everything, not allowing any idea to remain, but to learn to confront, to compare with the truth, to identify what comes from God and what does not. And that completely changes the game, because when the mind is trained in the truth, the deception loses strength. What once seemed convincing is beginning to be questioned, and clarity begins to emerge, protecting your decisions, your emotions, and your walk. Perhaps, at this point, you are beginning to realize that some thoughts that seem normal need to be analyzed more closely, and this is already a sign that discernment is being awakened within you. You didn't get here by chance. There is a purpose in this understanding that is being revealed now. If this spoke to you in a profound way, write in the comments, "God chose me," because to recognize this is also to assume a new way of thinking, more aligned, more conscious, more protected. There is a way for God to speak that does not make noise, does not draw external attention, but deeply marks the interior. They are those subtle impressions, those directions that arise in the mind in a calm but insistent way. And many times, those who do not develop spiritual sensitivity end up ignoring. Not because he doesn't want to listen, but because he doesn't recognize it. Gideon went through something similar. He was not someone who was safe. He did not have a firm confidence at first, and so he asked for signs. At Judges 6:17 he says, "If I have found favor in your eyes, give me a sign." This shows that he was seeking confirmation. He was seeking to be sure that it was God speaking. But what many don't realize is that, in addition to the external signals, there was an internal process going on. Because it is not enough for God to answer, it is necessary for the mind to be aligned to recognize this response. Without it, even a clear signal can be questioned, ignored, or misinterpreted. Gideon had to adjust his way of thinking, learn to trust, develop a sensitivity that went beyond fear and doubt. And that's exactly what happens today. God keeps talking, keeps directing, but often through inward impressions. A peace that arises when considering a decision, a discomfort that alerts you to a path, an unexpected clarity in the midst of doubt. All of this can be God's way of leading. But to realize this, the mind needs to be sensitive, and this sensitivity is not born of haste nor of distraction. It is born of humility. Psalm 25:9 states, "Guide the humble in righteousness." This means that the more the heart surrenders, the more the mind opens to perceive God's leading. Now think, how many times have you felt something inside you but ignored it? How many times has a direction come in a subtle way, but been replaced by doubts or external pressures? And then, looking back, did you realize that perhaps God was already showing the way? Honoring God in thoughts is also learning to value these impressions, not to treat them as something common, but as possible divine directions. It is to stop, to observe, to pray, before simply going with the flow. And over time, this practice begins to generate something powerful. The mind becomes more tuned, more attentive, more connected. What previously went unnoticed begins to be recognized, and God's direction stops seeming distant and begins to become part of your daily walk. Maybe you're expecting a clear answer, something evident, something impossible to ignore. But what if God is already speaking? Softly, inside your mind, just waiting for you to notice. Maybe you've been waiting for an answer for a long time, and this moment is no coincidence. There is something being aligned within you right now. Continue to the end, because what is yet to be revealed can help you to definitively recognize the direction that God has already begun to show. There is a kind of faith that only reveals itself when everything around it begins to fall apart. It is not the faith that depends on signs, nor that which rests on favorable circumstances. It is the one that is born and sustained within the mind, even when nothing makes sense on the outside. And it is exactly at this point that many give up, because they do not understand that true faith is built in thought before being seen in reality. Job lived this experience in an extreme way. In a short period of time, he lost possessions, children, stability, everything that could sustain his natural security. And in the midst of this scenario, what draws the most attention is not just the pain, but the way he chose to think. In Job 1:21, he declares, "The Lord gave him, the Lord took him. Blessed be the name of the Lord." This is not a common phrase. That's a mental decision. While everything around pointed to despair, his mind chose to remain steadfast in God. He didn't deny the pain, but he also didn't allow it to define his thoughts. And this is where the strength of unshakable faith lies. It is not the absence of suffering, but the ability not to allow suffering to destroy your trust in God. Because when the mind gives way completely to despair, faith weakens. But when the mind remains steadfast, even in the midst of pain, something powerful is preserved. Hebrews 10:23 reinforces this when it says, "Let us hold fast the confession of our hope." To hold tight means to hold, not to let go, not to allow it to escape, even when everything presses to the contrary. This happens first in the mind. It is there that the battle is fought. It is there that the decision is made. Now think, how many times have difficult situations tried to change your way of thinking? How many times have thoughts of giving up come up when something didn't go as expected? And without realizing it, the mind began to lean more toward the problem than toward God. But true faith does not ignore reality. She chooses not to limit herself to her. It keeps the mind connected with God, even when the answers are not immediate, and that creates a kind of force that doesn't depend on what's going on around you. The mind strengthened in faith becomes a shield. Negative thoughts may even arise, but they do not remain. Discouragement may knock on the door, but it does not find room to stay. Because there is a constant decision to trust, to remain, not to give up what God represents. And perhaps right now, you're facing something that tries to shake your faith, something that challenges your confidence, that generates questions, that brings uncertainty. But that word reveals that there is a possible choice to keep their thoughts firmly on God, regardless of the scenario. If this message reached you, it was not by chance. There is something being strengthened within you now, and if you want to continue receiving words that feed your faith and renew your mind, take advantage of this moment to subscribe to the channel and activate notifications. This can be the beginning of a journey where your mind becomes more and more firm and unshakable in the face of any situation. There is something that sustains the mind when everything around seems unstable. They are not favorable circumstances. They are not immediate answers, but the promises of God. When a person learns to think from these promises, he stops being carried away by the oscillations of life and starts to live with a stability that does not depend on what is happening at the moment. Abraham lived just that. He didn't just get a promise. He decided to live from it. Even as time passed, even when reality seemed to contradict what God had said, he continued to keep his thoughts in line with that truth. Romans 4:20-21 describes it powerfully. He did not doubt the promise of God through unbelief, but was strengthened in faith. This shows that his strength was not in what he saw, but in what he chose to think. Now imagine what that represents. Every day he had reason to question, to doubt, to consider impossible. But instead, he chose to meditate on the promise. He brought to his mind again and again what God had said. And this began to shape his way of seeing everything around him. Because when the mind is anchored in God's promises, something changes profoundly. Insecurity loses space, anxiety decreases, doubt begins to be replaced by silent confidence. Not because everything is solved, but because there is a greater certainty sustaining the interior. Joshua 21:45 states, "No promise has failed." This is not just a historical statement, it is a spiritual truth that crosses time. God does not fail in what he promises. And when that truth is absorbed by the mind, it becomes a firm foundation on which life can be built. The problem is that many know the promises, but do not live thinking about them. They are distant, forgotten, while other thoughts take their place. Worries, fears, negative scenarios, all this occupies the mind with ease. And when this happens, the person loses stability, even though they have access to the truth. To honor God in one's thoughts is also to constantly bring to mind what He has already said. It is choosing to remember, choosing to meditate, choosing to keep alive within you that which sustains your faith. Because the mind will always be occupied by something, and what you allow to stay there defines how you live. And little by little, this practice begins to transform everything. The way of reacting changes, the way of waiting changes, the way of trusting changes. The mind is no longer carried away by circumstances and is guided by promises that do not fail. Maybe you're living in a time where everything seems uncertain, where answers haven't arrived yet, where the wait seems long. But is there something that can sustain you now? Not what you see, but what God has already said. When the mind anchors itself in this, it finds stability, and this stability begins to influence every decision, every emotion, every step, creating a firm base where, even in the midst of uncertainties, there is peace. There are times when the mind seems to plunge into a darkness that is difficult to explain. It's not just sadness, it's not just tiredness. It is as if everything loses its color, as if hope was gradually fading. And the most challenging thing is that, in these moments, thoughts tend to reinforce this state even more, creating a cycle where everything seems to have no way out. Jeremiah knew this place like few others. He saw destruction, experienced losses, carried deep pains that marked his soul. It is not for nothing that he became known as the prophet of tears. His writings reveal an afflicted, overloaded mind, going through a scenario where, humanly, there was no reason to expect anything good. But in the midst of all this, something surprising happens. At Lamentations 3:21-23, he states, "I want to call to mind what can give me hope." Realize the choice. He didn't wait to feel hope. He decided to remember. He chose to direct his mind to something different from what he was experiencing. This reveals a powerful key. Hope is not born only from circumstances, it is born from what you decide to keep alive inside your mind. Jeremiah went on to say that the Lord's mercies are renewed every morning. Even in the midst of grief, he found a greater truth to sustain his thoughts. How many times does the mind get stuck only on what is going wrong, what was lost, what did not happen as expected? And without realizing it, the person begins to live within an internal narrative that reinforces the darkness. But there is a way out, and it starts with a conscious decision to remember what is still true. Romans 15:13 declares, "May the God of hope fill you with all joy and peace." This shows that hope is not just a feeling. It is something that comes from God, something that can fill the mind even when everything seems empty. Honoring God in thoughts is also this. Not allowing the mind to remain stuck in darkness, but bringing to mind that which can rekindle the light. It is remembering the promises, the times when God has already acted, the truths that do not change, even when everything around seems uncertain. And little by little, this movement begins to generate transformation. The darkness does not disappear all at once, but loses strength. The mind begins to find small points of light, small certainties, small reasons to continue. And this grows, occupying space, restoring the interior. Maybe you're living in a moment like this, where the mind seems tired, where thoughts are heavy, where hope seems distant. But this word reveals that there is still something that can be accessed, not outside, but inside you. Not many people will deeply understand this, but if you're here right now, there's a reason. God is trying to rekindle something inside of you, something that may have weakened over time. Continue to the end, because what is yet to be revealed may be just what you need to fully restore your hope. There is a moment before any victory happens on the outside, an invisible, silent moment where everything is decided within the mind. It is there that fear tries to settle in. It is there that doubt tries to grow. It is there that trust needs to be strengthened. And whoever wins in this place will inevitably see this victory manifest itself in reality. David shows us this clearly. By the time he arrived on the battlefield, everyone was already gripped with fear. Goliath was not just a physical enemy. He represented a mental giant. His words were intimidating, his presence paralyzed, and collective thinking was already defeated even before any confrontation took place. But David thought differently. While everyone saw an impossible giant to beat, he saw an opportunity for God to act. And that didn't come up at that moment. This was already formed within him. His mind was already aligned with who God was, and that shaped the way he saw the situation. In 1 Samuel 17:45, he firmly declares, "I go against you in the name of the Lord of hosts." This was not just a phrase of courage, it was the expression of an already established thought. Before he threw the stone, before he took any step, he had already won within his mind. Now think, how many battles have you faced where the biggest challenge is not outside, but inside you? Thoughts that say it won't work, that you're not capable, that it's better to give up. And without realizing it, these inner voices begin to weaken your position before you even try. But spiritual victory never begins externally. It begins when the mind decides to trust God above circumstances. When even in the face of something big, you choose to position yourself based on what God represents and not on the size of the problem. 1 Corinthians 15:57 says, "Thanks be to God who gives us the victory." This shows that victory does not come only from human effort. It comes from a connection with God that begins in the mind. It is there that you decide who you will trust. It is there that you choose which voice will prevail. David did not ignore the giant, but he also did not allow the giant to define his thoughts. He brought to mind his experiences with God, remembered past victories, strengthened his confidence, and this created within him a conviction that no external threat could shake. Honoring God in your thoughts is also this, not allowing fear to have the final word, but feeding the mind with that which strengthens faith. It is recognizing that, before any visible result, there is an internal battle that needs to be won. And when that happens, something changes. Insecurity loses strength, courage begins to emerge, and what seemed impossible begins to be faced differently. Because true victory doesn't start when you win away. It begins when you decide, within your mind, that God is greater than any giant that stands before you. There is a moment when a thought ceases to be just something internal and begins to carry a different weight. It is not a common concern. It is not just a passing idea. It's as if something inside you insists, draws attention, stays there, asking for an answer. And often, this is the beginning of something deeper spiritual: intercession. Esther experienced exactly this type of awakening. She was in a comfortable, protected position inside the palace, but there was a real threat against her people. And at that moment, something began to move inside her. It wasn't just external information, it was an internal consciousness, a thought that could no longer be ignored. In Esther 4:14, a phrase appears that changes everything. "Who knoweth whether thou hast come into the kingdom for such a time as this?" That wasn't just a question, it was a mental awakening. It was the moment when Esther realized that her position had a purpose, that her life was connected to something greater. But before any action, there was a decision within the mind. She had to overcome fear, face doubt, take on a responsibility that was not light. And all of this started in thought. Before acting, she decided. Before speaking, she took a position internally. This reveals something powerful. Intercession is born first in the mind. This is when a thought begins to carry a spiritual weight, when something inside you says it cannot remain silent. And if you ignore it, it keeps coming back. But if you respond, it turns into prayer. 1 Timothy 2:1 says, "Let supplications and prayers and intercessions be made." This shows that there is a call to go beyond thinking. It is to transform thought into clamor. It is to take what is inside and take it before God. How many times have you felt a weight for someone, for a situation, for something that seemed to stay on your mind? And maybe you ignored it, thinking it was just worry. But what if, in fact, it was an invitation to intercede? Honoring God in your thoughts is also recognizing these moments. Not only let the thought pass, but turn it into prayer, because when that happens, something changes. Thought ceases to be a burden and becomes a bridge between you and God. And from there, what seems small begins to gain spiritual strength. What was limited to the mind begins to reach heaven. And what seemed like just an internal feeling may actually be participating in something much bigger. Esther didn't just think. She acted on that thought. And his decision changed the fate of an entire nation. This shows that thoughts aligned with God are never empty. They carry purpose, direction, and impact. Perhaps at this moment something came to your mind. A person, a situation, a weight that you couldn't explain. But now it starts to make sense. Maybe this is not by chance. Maybe it's a calling. If this video is giving you answers you needed to hear, don't ignore this moment. Write in the comments, "I trust in God's action." Sometimes, a simple statement is the beginning of a surrender that can transform not only your life, but also the lives of others through your intercession. There is a level of purity that is born not only of human effort, but of the constant awareness of God's presence. Many people try to control behavior, avoid mistakes, change attitudes, but true transformation begins before that, in the invisible place of thoughts. Because when the mind is guarded, actions become consequences. Joseph lived this in an extraordinary way. In an environment completely contrary to God's principles, far from his land, with no one to observe or judge his choices, he was faced with a situation that could easily lead him astray. Humanly, everything favored the fall. But something inside him was stronger than any external circumstance. When he was tempted, his answer revealed the secret of his mind. "How then shall I do such wickedness and sin against God?" That's in Genesis 39:9. Notice that he didn't mention people. He didn't talk about visible consequences. He spoke of God. This shows that his mind was constantly aware of the divine presence. Joseph didn't just win at that moment. He had won before, inside the mind. He didn't wait for temptation to arrive to decide. He already lived with thoughts stored, aligned, protected. And that's exactly what made all the difference. Because true purity is not just about resisting error when it appears. It is not allowing it to form within you. It is to protect thought before it turns into desire, before it gains strength, before it becomes action. Jesus reinforces this in Matthew 5:8. "Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God." This reveals that purity is not just about avoiding sin. It's about seeing God clearly. A clear mind is not loaded with distractions, hidden intentions, contaminated thoughts. She becomes sensitive, open, able to perceive God's presence in details that others ignore. Now think, how many times is the struggle not in the action, but in the thought you allowed to grow? How many times did it all start with something small, seemingly harmless, but which over time gained strength within the mind? It is exactly at this point that vigilance needs to happen. To honor God in thoughts is to develop this constant awareness. It is to live as Joseph lived, knowing that God is present, even when no one else is. It is to protect the interior with the same intensity that many try to protect the exterior. And when that starts to happen, something changes profoundly. The mind becomes lighter, clearer, more sensitive. Wrong thoughts lose space because they do not find an environment to remain, and little by little God's presence ceases to be something distant and becomes something more easily perceived. A pure mind is not only disciplined, she reflects. It becomes a mirror of who God is, allowing His presence to be realized, lived, and expressed, even in the quietest details of life. There is a silent difference between visiting God's presence and walking with Him. Many live moments with God, but few develop continuity, and this continuity is not built only in isolated prayers or on specific occasions. It is born in the way the mind remains connected to Him throughout the day. Enoch experienced something that still draws attention today. The Bible does not describe great deeds, does not detail long journeys, but summarizes his life with a phrase that carries a deep weight. Enoch walked with God, and he didn't show up again. This is in Genesis 5:24. Walking with God is not an event, it's a lifestyle. It is a constancy, a closeness that is not limited to moments but extends to the whole time. This reveals that Enoch's mind was not disconnected from God most of the time. There was a continual alignment, a living awareness of the divine presence. He didn't have to stop everything to connect. He was already connected, and that's exactly what transforms intimacy. Because when thoughts begin to turn to God steadily, the relationship ceases to be occasional and becomes alive. It is no longer about seeking God only in times of need, but about living with Him even in the simplest of moments. David also expresses this profoundly in Psalm 63:6, "When I remember you on my couch and meditate on you in the watches." This shows that even in silence, even alone, his thoughts were directed toward God. It wasn't something forced, it was natural, continuous, part of his life. Now think, what occupies your mind most of the time? Where do your thoughts turn when there are no distractions? Because it is exactly in this space that intimacy is built or neglected. To honor God in one's thoughts is also to develop this quiet habit of remembering, of meditating, of bringing God to the center of one's mind over and over again, not as an obligation, but as a choice that little by little becomes natural. And when that starts to happen, something changes profoundly. The sense of distance diminishes, God's presence becomes more noticeable, and fellowship is no longer rare. The mind gets used to God, aligns itself with Him, abides in Him. And then, what once seemed distant becomes close. What seemed difficult becomes simple, because the mind no longer lives apart. She walks together. Thinking about God constantly is not losing focus in life. It is to give life a new meaning. It is to transform every moment into an opportunity for connection, every thought into a point of contact with the divine. And in the process, intimacy is no longer something you seek occasionally, and it becomes something that you live continuously, in silence, within your own mind. There is a delicate point in the spiritual journey where faith and doubt meet, and everything is decided in seconds within the mind. It is not the size of the problem that defines the outcome, but what you allow to remain in your thoughts at that moment. Pedro lived this experience intensely. He did something that no one else had the courage to do. He got out of the boat and began to walk on the water. This already reveals that at that moment his mind was completely aligned with the word of Jesus. He didn't look at the wind. He didn't think about the waves. He didn't consider the impossible. He just trusted. But something changed along the way. Matthew 14:30-31 describes this moment accurately. But when he felt the strong wind, he was afraid, and he began to go to the bottom and cried out, "Lord, save me." And immediately Jesus stretched forth his hand and took hold of him, and said unto him, "O thou of little faith, why hast thou doubted?" The detail is here. He started out well, but allowed other thoughts to creep in. The wind was already there before. The waves did not appear suddenly. What has changed is the focus of the mind. He took his eyes off Jesus and began to consider that which previously had no power over him. And the moment doubt gained space, its internal structure was shaken. This shows something profound. Doubt doesn't have to be big to make an impact. It just needs to be accepted. A thought, a small uncertainty, an unfiltered question. And little by little it begins to weaken what was once firm. James 1:6 gives direct guidance. Ask in faith, not doubting. This does not mean that thoughts of doubt will never arise, but that they should not remain. There is a difference between being confronted by a thought and accepting that thought as truth. Honoring God in your thoughts is also developing this spiritual resistance. It's noticing when doubt tries to enter and not giving space. It is to quickly turn the focus to God, to the truth, to what sustains faith. Peter did not sink because the sea was strong. He began to sink because his mind split. And this happens to this day. People who start out trusting, but halfway through allow contrary thoughts to gain space. But there is a clear way out. Keep your mind steady, not in the problem, not in the circumstance, but in God. Because when thought remains aligned with Him, faith is sustained, even in impossible scenarios. And perhaps, at this moment, you are exactly at that point. He started believing, but something on the way brought doubt, brought insecurity, brought questions. But this word reveals that it is still possible to readjust the focus, strengthen the mind, and remain steadfast. In the next few moments, something even deeper will be revealed, something that can help you protect your mind even more solidly and definitively. Stay tuned, because this might be just what you need to not just keep going, but to win completely. There is a level of spiritual life where a person stops being dominated by one's own thoughts and starts to govern them with authority. And this completely changes the way of living, because while the mind is loose, any idea finds space, any suggestion gains strength. But when there is domination, the mind becomes a protected territory. Jesus demonstrated this clearly in the wilderness. He was tempted, confronted, exposed to thoughts that tried to divert him from God's will, but at no time did he negotiate with these ideas. He didn't analyze, he didn't consider, he didn't give space. He answered firmly, truthfully, authoritatively. In Luke 4:8 he declares, "The Lord your God you shall worship, and Him only shall you serve." This was not just a response to the enemy, it was an affirmation of internal positioning. Jesus' mind was already aligned, it was already decided, it was already established, and for this reason, no contrary thought could remain. This reveals something powerful. Spiritual authority begins in the way you deal with your thoughts. It's not just about expelling something external, but about not allowing the internal to be dominated. It is understanding that not every thought needs to be accepted. Not every idea deserves attention. 2 Timothy 1:7 reinforces this when it says, "God has given us not a spirit of fear, but of power." This means that there is a God-given ability to govern one's mind. Do not live hostage to fear, doubt, or confusion, but exercise dominion, firmness, clarity. Now think. How many times do thoughts come up and you just accept it, as if you have no choice? As if he were forced to deal with it without being able to react. But the truth is that there is authority available. There is the possibility of rejecting, of replacing, of aligning again. Honoring God in your thoughts is also exercising that dominion. It is noticing when something is not coming from him and immediately repositioning the mind, not with empty effort, but with truth, just as Jesus did. Responding with that which was already established within him. And this does not happen by chance. It is the fruit of a disciplined, trained, strengthened mind in the Word. Because the more the truth takes up space, the less deception finds a place. The more the mind is aligned, the more natural it becomes to reject that which does not belong. And little by little, something begins to change. The mind ceases to be a disorganized battlefield and becomes a governed territory. Thoughts start to filter faster. Decisions become clearer. Confusion loses strength. Spiritual authority is not just about facing great challenges. It's about winning small daily battles within the mind. It's about deciding over and over again that only what comes from God will have space. And when that authority is exercised, the mind ceases to be vulnerable and becomes a powerful, aligned, firm, and completely available instrument for God's will. There is a silent force capable of completely transforming the way you think, even when nothing around you changes. It is not something external. It does not depend on favorable circumstances. It is born within the mind as a decision. And that strength is gratitude. Many people believe that they can only be thankful when everything is fine, when things happen as expected. But Paul reveals an entirely different path. He wrote profound words while he was imprisoned, physically limited, surrounded by hardship. And yet, his mind was not imprisoned. In 1 Thessalonians 5:18, he declares, "In everything give thanks." It's not for everything. It's in everything. This means that regardless of the situation, there is a possible choice within the mind to give thanks. And this choice begins to change the way reality is perceived. Paul reinforces this at Philippians 4:11 when he says, "I have learned to be content in every situation." Notice this word, I learned. That wasn't automatic, it wasn't natural at first. It was a process. He trained his mind not to depend on circumstances to find peace. Now think, how many times are your thoughts dominated by what is missing, by what didn't work out, by what could have been different? And without realizing it, the mind enters a cycle where dissatisfaction grows, anxiety increases, and peace is distant. But gratitude breaks this cycle. She changes the focus. Instead of looking only at the problem, the mind begins to see that which still stands, that which has yet been preserved, that which still carries the goodness of God. And that doesn't mean ignoring difficulties. It means not allowing them to be the only reference. Gratitude brings balance. She recalls that even in the midst of challenges, God continues to be present, continues to act, continues to sustain. Honoring God in one's thoughts is also developing this practice. It is choosing, even on difficult days, to find reasons to be grateful, not as an empty repetition, but as an internal repositioning. Gradually, this begins to transform the structure of the mind. Negative thoughts lose strength because they no longer find the same space. Anxiety begins to subside because the mind is no longer focused only on what worries, and a different peace begins to emerge, a peace that does not depend on what is happening outside. Paul understood this. He discovered that true freedom was not in the circumstances, but in the way he chose to think. And it kept him grounded, even in situations that could destroy anyone else emotionally. And perhaps this is one of the most powerful changes you can experience, realizing that even without controlling everything around you, you can transform what happens inside your mind. When gratitude becomes part of your thoughts, something realigns. The mind approaches the goodness of God. The vision expands, and what once seemed heavy begins to lose control. And little by little, without realizing it, you start to live differently. Not because everything has changed around you, but because your thoughts are now connected with something bigger, firmer, and deeper. There is a silent trap that steals the peace of many people without them realizing it. It is not only the excess of problems, but the excess of distractions. The mind begins to divide into so many worries, so many tasks, so many thoughts at the same time, that it loses the ability to focus on what really matters. And when this happens, anxiety finds space. Martha lived exactly this scenario. She wasn't doing something wrong, she was serving, caring, taking care of herself with responsibilities. But at the same time, his mind was overloaded. In Luke 10:41-42, Jesus says, "Martha, Martha, you are anxious and worry about many things." Notice that the problem was not the action, it was the condition of the mind. Meanwhile, Maria made a completely different choice. She decided to stop, sit down, and focus on the presence of Jesus, not because there were no other things to do, but because he understood what was essential at that moment. And Jesus made it clear she chose the better part. This reveals a powerful principle. Not everything that occupies your mind has the same value. There are urgent things, but there are eternal things. And when the mind does not learn to differentiate this, it gets lost in excess, gets tired of the unnecessary, and distances itself from what it really sustains. How many times have you felt this way? Thinking about several things at the same time, trying to solve everything, carrying worries that don't stop, and in the midst of it, feeling that something is missing, that peace is not present. This doesn't just happen by what you do, but by what you allow to occupy your mind. 2 Corinthians 4:18 gives a clear direction. We do not look at the things that are seen, but at the things that are not seen. This means that the focus needs to go beyond the immediate. It is not a matter of ignoring reality, but of not limiting oneself to it. It is learning to give priority to what is eternal, to what really strengthens, to what brings life. Honoring God in your thoughts is also making this daily choice. It is noticing when the mind is dispersed and redirecting. It is understanding that not everything deserves your attention, not everything needs to take up space within you. And when this adjustment begins to happen, something changes profoundly. Anxiety loses strength because the mind is no longer divided in so many directions. Clarity increases because the focus is on what really matters, and God's presence becomes more noticeable because now there is room for it. Perhaps what is missing is not more time, nor more solutions, but more focus on the essentials. More moments where the mind quiets down and turns to what really sustains. At the end of this journey, something even deeper will be released. Something that can completely transform how you live and connect with God. Stay until the end, because you can feel something that goes beyond words, something that touches directly within you. There is a level of surrender that goes beyond words, beyond intentions, beyond emotional moments. It is when the mind consciously decides to surrender completely to God. Not just in parts, not just when it's convenient, but in a total way. And this kind of surrender doesn't happen once. It is a daily, silent, and profound act. The story of Abraham and Isaac carries this symbolism in an intense way. When God asked for Isaac, he was not asking for just one son. He was asking for the place he occupied in Abraham's heart and mind. And at that moment, Abraham had to make an internal decision before any external action. He had to align his thoughts with God's will, even though he didn't fully understand it. Isaac on the altar represents just that, an unreserved surrender. And when we look at our life, we realize that God is not only asking for external attitudes, He's looking at the thoughts, at what you hold inside, at what you have not yet fully surrendered. Romans 12:1 says, "Present your bodies a living sacrifice." But that sacrifice begins in the mind. Before any action, there is an internal surrender. There is a moment when you decide to trust, even if you don't have all the answers, where you give up control, your own paths, your own certainties. And that's not easy, because the mind naturally wants to understand everything, control everything, anticipate everything. But surrender breaks that pattern. She says, even without fully understanding, I choose to trust. Even without seeing the result, I choose to deliver. Psalm 51:10 expresses this deep desire. Create in me, O God, a clean heart. This includes thoughts, intentions, motivations. It is a request for inner transformation, for a mind that does not resist God's will, but makes itself available to it. Honoring God in your thoughts is also living this continuous surrender. It's noticing when the mind is trying to take control and consciously giving it back to God. It is letting go of thoughts that generate anxiety, fear, or pride, and replacing them with trust, dependence, and faith. And when that surrender begins to become practical, something powerful happens. The mind becomes light. The weight of trying to control everything begins to fade, and in its place a different peace arises, a peace that comes from trust. The surrendered mind becomes a fertile ground, because now, instead of resistance, there is openness. Instead of confusion, there is direction. Instead of internal struggle, there is alignment. And in this space, God's will begins to flourish naturally. Maybe there's something you're still holding inside your mind. A worry, a plan, a fear, something you haven't been able to fully surrender yet. But this is a moment of quiet decision, a moment where you can, internally, put that on the altar. Nothing in this life happens without a purpose. If that word has found you now, there is something being lined up within you. If you feel this in your heart, write in the comments, I believe, Lord. Sometimes a simple statement is the beginning of a surrender that can completely transform your life. Everything that has been built so far reveals a profound truth. Your thoughts are not only yours, they are spiritual seeds that need to be delivered, aligned, and consecrated before God. And when that awareness awakens, something inevitable arises within you. The need to not only understand, but to take a stand, because there comes a time when thinking is no longer enough. It is necessary to transform these thoughts into an encounter, into presence, into real communion with God. This is exactly what we see in Daniel's life. Even in the midst of pressure, threats, and a totally contrary environment, he maintained something non-negotiable: his constant connection with God. Daniel 6:10 says 3 times in the day he would get down on his knees and pray. This was not an empty habit. It was continuous alignment between mind and heaven. And that's the point where everything is, where that which is within you needs to be placed before God, where thoughts are no longer just internal and become surrender. Jeremiah 29:13 states, You will seek me and find me when you search for me with all your heart. There is a promise here. When there is true surrender, there is real encounter. Now this is the time to take that step, to leave the understanding and enter the presence, to open your heart, quiet your mind, and allow God to touch you exactly where you need it most. Let's pray. Beloved Father, your word reminds us that you know every thought before it is even formed, and yet you invite us to approach you with confidence. At this moment, with an open heart, we place ourselves before your presence, recognizing that we need you even in what no one sees, in our mind. Lord, we thank you for all that has been revealed so far, for every teaching, for every truth that has touched our inner self. Thank you that the Lord does not only look outward, but cares deeply about what happens inside us. Thank you that even when our thoughts are lost, your grace reaches us and brings us back. Father, we ask you now for strength and wisdom. Teach us to govern our thoughts, to reject that which is not of thee, and to stand firm in thy truth. Give us discernment to recognize your voice, courage to obey, and faith to trust, even when we don't understand everything. May our minds be renewed daily by your presence. Lord, visit now every person who is praying. It touches those who are mentally tired, overwhelmed by worries, afflicted by thoughts that do not cease. It brings rest, it brings relief, it brings clarity. For those facing financial difficulties, it opens doors and brings provision. To those who are sick, pour out healing. For the wounded families, it releases reconciliation and peace. It spiritually strengthens those who are weakened. It rekindles faith where it has almost been extinguished. At this moment in silence, each heart presents before you what it needs most. Every pain, every struggle, every request that only the Lord knows. Father, we commend everything into your hands, our thoughts, our worries, our dreams, and even what we still don't know how to solve. We trust that you are in control, that nothing escapes your gaze, and that your plan is perfect even when we can't see it. May your peace, as it is written in Philippians 4:7, now invade every mind, keeping thoughts and emotions in Christ Jesus. Let there be rest, let there be lightness, let there be a new way of thinking being established from this moment on, and we declare in faith that our mind belongs to the Lord. May our thoughts be aligned with your will, and that, from today on, we will live more consciously of your presence in us. In Jesus' name, amen. If this prayer touched your heart in a special way, write Amen in the comments and allow this statement to be the beginning of something new happening inside you. Throughout this journey, one truth became clear. Honoring God in thoughts is not something distant. It is a daily practice that transforms everything. Every thought you choose to feed, every idea you allow to linger, is shaping your life in a quiet but powerful way. And maybe today you realize something you had never stopped to think about before, that your mind is the place where your spiritual life really begins. This message is for you, and not by chance. God chose you to hear this today because there is something He wants to align within you. It's not about perfection, it's about direction. It's not about never making mistakes, but about learning to come back, adjust, and stay. Now the question that remains is, what are you going to do with what God has just shown you? Will you continue to allow any thought to take up space, or will you begin to transform your mind into a place where God's presence dwells? I'm very happy to know that we're together so far, really. There's something special about people who decide to seek more of God, and you are part of it. I want to invite you, with great affection, to leave your like and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, because that way you continue to walk with us on this journey. But more than that, I want to meet you. Comment below where you are watching and, if you feel in your heart, share a little of what you are experiencing. We read, pray, and walk together. Your story matters, your life matters, and God is seeing every detail. And it doesn't stop here. In the next video, we'll dive even deeper into how to live a life that is fully aligned with God by understanding signs, directions, and paths that often go unnoticed. There is something prepared that can open your spiritual vision even more, and I am sure it will speak directly to you. Allow God to continue speaking to your heart. Take the next step on this journey by watching the next video that will appear here on the screen. In it, we will continue to learn how to live in God's presence and experience the fullness of His plans. Don't stop here, because God still has much more to speak to you. Always remember, God is greater than any attack. Trust Him, and He will do infinitely more than you can imagine. May God bless your life, and I'll wait for you in the next video.